Okay. So, good afternoon. I like to apologize for the fact that I still cannot address in your beautiful language. I must confess that I found the question which was put to me rather challenging, because in the 70s and in the 80s I used to work with the Austrian peace movement, and the reference point of the Austrian peace movement always has been neutrality, which meant, for example, that when at the beginning of the 80s the US and the NATO decided to deploy nuclear middle-range missiles in Western European countries, Austria had not to apply this decision because it has been a neutral country. Although it was a little bit illusory to believe that in case there was a nuclear war in Europe, Austria would have been saved. However, it was a political fact that we need not to follow this kind of politics. And we managed to do pretty good things. When in 1973 the junta in Chile ordered tanks from Austria, and an Austrian, by the way, nationalized company, decided to export tanks, a big movement managed to have passed a law which was based on the idea of neutrality, which outruled the possibility of exporting particular arms to countries which disregard human rights. So I would love, or would have loved, to talk on these kind of issues and to give a picture of neutrality as the alternative. However, Bruno Kreisky, who was a champion of Austrian neutrality, always opposed the idea of a neutral Germany, as he was convinced that neutrality, permanent neutrality as a concept, only applied for small countries. And this, of course, restricts then the applicability of the concept, let's say for Italy, for example, but also for Europe. So I decided then to try to place this discussion in the current European context. Meanwhile, it is a commonplace that, pardon me, that the crisis of 2007, 2008 was not only a financial crisis, and it was more than an ordinary crisis of the capitalist cycle. It embraced the social and welfare systems, it affected the political systems, and it is a moral crisis, and it is as well a crisis of foreign policies of the European Union, demonstrating that the deeper essence of this crisis has to do with the critical state of the European model of production and consumption, the crisis of the relations between Europe and the competing imperialist centers, and in particular the US, and thirdly, the relations of Europe with the entire world, which is characterized through unbearable inequalities, through ecological disasters, through the necessities to adapt to climate change. So in one word, and I refer to this author rather frequently, we are in a situation which Karl Polanyi, an economist, Austrian-Hungarian descendants of the 30s, described as a great transformation, but in this context, a great transformation on the global scale. And this complexity of the crisis, at least in my opinion, is the deep reason for the apparently irresistible rise of the far right in Europe, which is not concerning a number of European countries, but which must be assessed as a European phenomenon, which of course has to do with austerity politics and neoliberalism. But notice that countries like Spain, Portugal, or Greece, who are mostly affected by austerity policies, do not have, or do not have yet, so far, successful parties of the far right, while countries of the European North and of the center of Europe display this phenomenon, obviously connected with the discomfort of large number of people with the state of democracy in Europe. However, while this is more or less conventional wisdom among political scientists, I believe that there is also a sort of malfunction of the European mindset. To put it in a nutshell, while mainstream media and politicians and large numbers of the populations believe that the big problem consists in the integration of 1.5 million refugees in a population of 500 million, the real integration problem of the future consists in that these 500 million people in Europe, living more or less in privileged conditions, have to integrate themselves in a world which in 2025 will be populated by 10 billion people. And I think that the vague idea of this change in the objective conditions of living, which for the moment is epitomized through the advent of refugees, is the reason for this insecurity, for this anxiousness, which drives people in the hands of far-right and nationalist parties. Their answer to the problem is clear-cut: an authoritarian state with a developed toolkit of repressive methods, welfare chauvinism, meaning social state arrangements for us only, fortress Europe, keeping them away, in case it's necessary, send troops to remote places in order to repress upheavals, and nationalism. But look, nationalism is dangerously contradictory. It may be so that Marine Le Pen praised the alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, last weekend for the alarming electoral success which they had in one of the German Länder. And it may be so that the AfD admires Marine Le Pen. And you can call both nationalists, however the nationalism refers to different nations, meaning their nationalism is like water and fire. And that's why it is very little likely that European politics can be based on this kind of competing nationalisms between the major power. We witness now a growing Euroscepticism also inside the left, for which the main reason is that the European Union does not deliver what it has promised. The policy of austerity applied through authoritarian methods has led European integration into an impasse. And if let's say that 12 million voters for parties of the European left, or a considerable part of it, turn their backs towards the idea of European integration, it's due to this politics. And in the first place, this is a problem of the European Union. It's not the problem of the European left party or parties that there is this huge disenchantment about European integration. At the same time, I must admit that I always feel very uncomfortable hearing people of the left talking about Plan B, about Lexit, and I wonder, do we believe that the problems ahead of the European societies could better be managed in a Europe of 25, 28, 35 or 55 national currencies, national border regimes? I doubt this. And then, and this is already very close to the subject of neutrality, what do we think might be the probable outcome of a dismembering of the European Union? It won't be a Europe of 28 nicely coexisting, fairly trading and cooperating nation states. As Europe still will remain in a globalized world with all its problems, it will be again a Europe characterized by the competition of mid-sized powers for prevalence and dominance on the European soil. And add to this that from the crisis of European integration, not only the European Union is concerned, the result of the Brexit referendum demonstrate quite clearly that there is also a crisis of the European states. Or take the example of Central and Eastern Europe, where still the borders created after World War I do not correspond to the ethnical and national composition of the populations, and in which the spectra of nationalism is closely connected with the idea for every people, for every nation, one state, immediately causing contradictions between neighboring states. I can mention Southern Tyrol, I can mention Siebenbürgen, I can mention Sudeten, Germany, and so on and so forth. So what's the alternative? It's now not my subject to talk on the European Union, although the issue of neutrality as a concept of international policy is closely connected with the understanding of national sovereignty and transnational democracy. However, it's about international policy and about neutrality. First of all, let me clarify the concepts. A neutral country in a particular war is a sovereign state which officially declares itself to be neutral towards the belligerents. A permanent neutral country is a sovereign state which is bound by international treaty to be neutral towards belligerents of all further wars. In the Austrian case, and I quote now from the constitutional law of the Austrian neutrality, which was adopted in 1955, actually as a condition for the withdrawal of the foreign troops which liberated the country. I quote, "For the purpose of the continuous assertion of its external independence and for the purpose of the inviolability of its territory, Austria declares voluntarily its permanent neutrality, and it declares to defend it by any means at its disposal." End of the quotation. According to the Hague Convention of 1907, this applies a number of duties to the neutral state. For example, not allowing for foreign troops to be transported through its territory, not allowing for military bases as its territory, equal trade relations in case of wars, and so on and so forth. Most interesting for our debate might be the phrase, defend by all means which are at its disposal, which makes the reference to Switzerland and to the Switzerland interpretation of neutrality as the example. And you know, the most interesting things are, of course, the contradictions. Because while making this reference to the Swiss model of neutrality, in 1955, Austria simultaneously applied for becoming member of the United Nations, while in Switzerland it took until 2002 to enter the United Nations, which shows, and this is also confirmed by the fact that the understanding and the interpretation of permanent neutrality by the 5 permanent neutral countries of the European Union, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Austria, and Malta, is quite different. So what it shows, it is a subject to political struggle. You may call it, as this is modern, an empty signifier, open for different and controversial interpretations, but at any rate not what people in Austria or in Sweden who want to see the respective countries in the NATO now suggest, that namely neutrality was bound to the bipolarity of the Cold War constellation in Europe. It is not. It is a matter of historical circumstances and in the first place of political struggle. However, the commonality of all the different interpretations of permanent neutrality in Europe is, I quote, permanent neutrality means refusal of participating in wars, end of the quotation, of Manfred Rotter, who is one of the most important experts and professors in international law in Austria. How can this refusal be performed in a world in which conflict research tells us for 2015 409 armed conflicts took place, of which 19 had been pertinent to the category of high degree of violence. In a world in which ecological disaster, inequality in income, access to resources, to energy, and so on must be regarded as the main reasons for conflicts and mass migration. Obviously, these historic circumstances cannot be coped with a merely passive attitude, a refusal to participate in war, but require rather an active interpretation of neutrality, which, by the way, a position which already has been assumed by Bruno Kreisky and Olof Palme in the 80s. The principles of their politics has been, first, contributing to global foreign policy, second, fostering disarmament, in particular nuclear disarmament, thirdly, strengthening the principle of non-violence as stipulated in the UN Charter, and fourthly, providing useful services for intermediation and prevention of conflicts. And without now going into the details, you can easily imagine that from all of these principles, a particular set of policies can be deduced and must be deduced. Evidently, these are useful and necessary ethical principles which might create a frame for a foreign policy, not only of single states, but for the European Union in its entirety. However, the course is set in different directions. In 2013, the EU summit in December has officially announced that foreign and security policies of the European Union will develop in complementarity and strategic partnership with the NATO. A conjunction which I find disastrous, and you can see this every day. For example, in the pathetic role which actually the European Union foreign policy played in the civil war in the Ukraine and the confrontation which it triggered with Russia. The European Union, meanwhile, has multiplied its out-of-order operations, of which the personnel to 75% consists in military troops. Irrespectively, regardlessly of these operations are called civil operations or military operations, 75% of the personnel are military. As I said, active neutrality is an empty signifier. It is a battlefield for the ideological, intellectual, and political struggle. If the European Union commits itself to a foreign and security policy which is based on the ideas of peace and solidarity, it must separate itself from the military structure of NATO. But would that imply automatically that the European Union itself become a military superpower? I believe on the opposite. European Union should respect the fact that security in Europe must be based on a plurality of organizations and political frames, such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe or the European Council. There must be a pluralistic security architecture in Europe. Let me conclude these short remarks by saying, Europe will be social, ecological, and democratic, or it will not be. It will be peaceful, or it will perish. Let's be prepared for different scenarios. However, let's fight for the better ones. I thank you for your attention.